History remembers the phoenix as a symbol of resurrection, a bird that burns, a bird that rises, hope in feathers. But what if the real miracle is not the rising? What if the real miracle is the letting go? 500 years of flight, of sunlight, of the scent of cinnamon on warm air, and then a choice, not a death, a release. Now let that question settle. Let your shoulders fall just slightly away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be. The story has waited a very long time. It can wait a few more breaths. If it feels right, let your eyes close now, or leave them open, soft, resting on something still. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Picture, if you like, the edge of a spice grove at the hour before sunset. The air is thick with the scent of myrrh and cassia. Warm light filters through the cinnamon trees in long, slow shafts. Somewhere ahead, among the frankincense and the drifting motes of gold, a story is resting. It has no hero. It has no villain. It has only a bird and a fire and an ancient, unbroken trust. This story does not ask you to believe in miracles. It only asks you to remember something you already know. That what is burned can still be whole. That what seems ended can begin again. And that nothing is ever truly lost. That is the promise the phoenix has kept for 1,000 years. It is already settled. It is already waiting for you. If this is the kind of story you'd like to keep returning to, you're welcome to stay a while. There's no need to do anything more than that. And if you'd like, leave a comment below and tell me 3 things. What time it is where you are right now, where in the world you're listening from, and if there's another creature already stirring in your thoughts, one whose story you'd like told this way. I read every one. I'm always listening for what to find next, so now let the path carry you back. Back before the temples, back before the priests, back to the very first morning the sun ever rose, and the first living thing opened its eyes. Chapter 1. The Silence Before the Sun. There was nothing, not darkness, for darkness needs something to be dark. There was only water still, endless, without shore or sky or surface. The waters of none had no memory, because nothing had yet happened to remember. No wind stirred them, no light touched them. They simply were, as they had always been, and they held within themselves the weight of everything that had not yet begun. Beneath that stillness, something waited. Not a creature, not a god with form, but a possibility so vast and so patient that it had no name. The Egyptians would later call it Atum, the one who is not yet, the one who contains all that will be. But on this day, in this moment, before moments, it was only a warmth gathering somewhere beneath the flood, a pulse not yet quickened. The change, when it came, was not sudden. It was a softening at the edge of the world, a faint lessening of the deep. Where there had been only the perfect, unbroken dark, a thread of something paler began to unravel along the horizon. Not gold, yet only the memory of gold. Not light, yet only the promise that light had been waiting to keep. And then the sun rose. For the first time, the sun rose. No eye witnessed it. No stone cast a shadow. The waters of none caught the light and held it, and the whole of the dark sea became a mirror for something it had never seen before. The warmth spread across the flood like a breath across cold glass, and the world, though still empty, was no longer still. From the center of that shining water, something solid began to rise. It pushed upward without hurry, a dark shape against all that gold, a mound of stone, ancient before anything was ancient, its surface black as the pupil of an unopened eye. This was the Bennu, the first land, the first thing that could be touched. It broke the surface without sound and held steady, as if it had been waiting too. The stone was not smooth. Its four faces sloped sharply to a rounded apex, and within its charcoal black body ran veins of pale gold that caught the new light and glowed like threads of fire trapped in glass. Around it, the waters were perfectly still now, as though the sea itself understood that something sacred had just occurred. The first island, the first altar, the first place where anything could happen. And on that stone, something moved. It was not a god descending from the sky. It was not a creature swimming up from the deep. It was an emergence, a gathering of light and warmth and the quiet will to exist. The Egyptians would one day call it the Bennu, the self-created one, the soul of the sun itself taking form. But here, at the beginning, it was simply the first living thing. The shape it took was that of a bird, tall and slender, a crane-like form of impossible grace. Its feathers were not yet the crimson and gold they would become. They were pale, like the inside of a shell, like the first light before the sun remembers its color. It stood motionless on the peak of the Benben, its long neck curved in a single, perfect question, and it looked toward the sun with eyes that had never closed because they had never opened. There is no need to picture the moment too precisely. It is enough to know that the first dawn was quiet and that something alive was there to see it. The bird did not sing. It did not stretch its wings. It only stood, a silhouette of patience against the newborn light, while the warmth of Ra settled into its bones and the world held its breath. Everything that would ever burn began here. And then the eye opened, a single eye, brilliant and gold, not the gold of metal, but the gold of a flame that has just caught. It held no fear, because fear had not been invented. It held no sorrow, because nothing had yet been lost. It only held the light of the first sun, reflected back toward the God who sent it, as if to say, I am here. I am the answer. The cycle has begun. The bird did not yet have a name. Names were a gift the world had not learned to give. It did not need one. It knew itself the way the sun knows itself, not by thought, but by warmth, by the simple fact of being. It stood on the dark stone and felt the light move across its pale feathers, and the feeling was enough. It was the first living being, and it was content. The sun climbed higher, and the world began to unfold. The waters of none, which had been a single endless mirror, now showed themselves as a sea with a shore, though the shore was only the promise of one. A faint line of silt and wet sand gathering at the base of the Benben. The bird watched this happen without understanding, because understanding had not yet been created. It only watched, and its watching was a kind of blessing. From the bird's throat, a sound rose. It was not a song. Songs require memory, and memory did not exist. It was a low, resonant cry, the first voice ever to break the silence of the world. The sound traveled across the water, and where it touched, the water seemed to grow warmer. The Egyptians would later call this cry the sound of creation, the note that called order from chaos. The warmth of Ra continued to settle into the bird's form. It was not merely being warmed, it was being shaped. Each pale feather held the light a little longer. Each breath drew in something of the sun. The bird did not know it, but it was becoming a vessel, a living reliquary for the fire that would one day consume and renew it. The first phoenix was being forged in stillness, without flame, without pain. Time, as we understand it, had not yet begun. There were no hours, no seasons, no count of years. There was only the slow, steady rhythm of light and the bird's own heartbeat, two pulses that seemed to echo one another across the empty sea. Morning became noon. Noon began its long descent toward evening. The first day of creation was passing, and the bird remained, a sentinel on the stone. As the sun sank toward the water, the bird felt something new, a cooling at the edge of its feathers, a softening of the light. It did not know the word for this. We would call it evening, or perhaps loss, but it felt it as a quiet question. Would the light return? The bird had no answer. It only watched the horizon, its golden eye unblinking, and waited. The sun touched the water, and the world caught fire. The sea became a sheet of molten copper and rose. The sky deepened to violet and crimson, and the Bennu cast its first shadow, a long, dark finger, stretching across the glowing flood. The bird saw its own silhouette for the first time, thrown against the water, and it did not look away. It was the first creature to witness a sunset, and it found it beautiful. The darkness returned, but it was not the same darkness that had existed before. It carried memory now. It had known light. The bird folded its long legs beneath itself and rested on the warm stone, its pale feathers soft against the cooling rock. The stars had not yet appeared. The sky was still inventing them, but the bird was not afraid. It had felt the sun once, and it trusted that the sun would return. In that trust, the whole of the myth was already written. The bird did not know it would one day burn. It did not know it would rise from ash. It only knew, in the deep quiet of its first night, that the light was true, and that it would come again. That single, unshakable faith placed not in a god, but in the rhythm of the world itself, was the first prayer ever prayed, and it was prayed by a bird. And so the first day ended, and the first night passed, and the first living creature slept beneath a sky that had not yet learned to hold stars. It dreamed no dreams, for dreams had not been invented. But somewhere inside its breast, where the warmth of Ra still glowed faintly, a seed was already planted. The seed of fire, the promise of return. It would not burn yet. That was for another age. But the promise was there, resting in the dark, waiting for the morning that would one day call it forth. Chapter 2. The Soul That Chose Its Form. The bird was not born. It was not created by any god's hand, not shaped from clay or breathed into being from the nostrils of a divine potter. It simply emerged, a gathering of light that remembered itself, a warmth that chose a form. The Egyptians understood this better than anyone. The Bennu was the soul of the sun, and the sun had no parent. It was, and because it was, the bird was. The second dawn came, and the bird on the Bennu stone watched the horizon with brilliant, liquid gold eyes that had already learned the shape of hope. The light returned exactly as the darkness had promised, and the bird felt the warmth spread across its pale feathers like a hand pressed gently against a sleeping face. The trust it had placed in the dark was justified. The sun was faithful. The bird would never forget this. As the sun climbed, something began to change within the bird's form. The pale shell ivory of its plumage, so soft and unformed in the first light of creation, began to deepen at the chest. A flush of color spread outward from the single circular marking of palest gold. First a blush, then a warmth, then a rich, unmistakable crimson, the exact shade of smoldering embers. The bird was being painted by the sun itself, feather by feather. The transformation was not painful. There was no burning, no rending, no cry of anguish. It was a quiet filling, as though the light had been gathering inside the bird all through the first night and was now blooming outward. The wings caught the gold next, a rich, warm gold, with the faintest shimmer of violet iridescence along the edges, like sunlight catching oil on still water. The long flight feathers deepened to violet at the base, fading to pale ash gray at the tips. The bird stretched its wings for the first time. Not to fly at the sky was still new, and the bird had no destination but to feel the full span of its own form. The wings opened wide, catching the morning light, and the full palette of the phoenix was revealed for the first time. Deep crimson chest, rich gold wings, those extravagant tail plumes of molten amber, and soft coral pink tipped with pale ivory eye spots. The bird was no longer pale. It was aflame, without fire. It turned its long, slender neck and looked down at the still water beneath the Benben stone. There, on the dark, glassy surface, it saw itself for the first time. The brilliant, liquid gold eye met its own reflection, and the bird did not look away. It saw the slender crest of 3 delicate feathers curving from its crown, pale gold at the base, deepening to crimson at the tip. It saw the polished obsidian black beak, the elegant crane-like body, the living color that now glowed from every feather. It knew, without words, that this was its true form. The bird lowered its head toward the water, and its reflection rose to meet it. Beak touched beak in a silent, weightless kiss, the first living creature to recognize itself. The Egyptians would later carve this moment into temple walls. The Bennu, gazing into the waters of Nun, and understanding that it was the soul of Ra, the visible heart of the invisible God. Not a servant, not a messenger, the soul itself, given wings. There is no need to picture every feather, every shift of color across the bird's body. It is enough to know that by the time the sun reached its peak, the phoenix was complete. The transformation had happened not through violence, but through stillness. Not through destruction, but through a slow, sacred filling. The bird was not made. It had become, and the difference was everything. The bird raised its head and looked toward the sun, and in a gesture that would echo across every century to come, it bowed. A single, deliberate inclination of that graceful neck, the crest feathers catching the light. It was not worship, not quite. It was acknowledgement. One eternal being greeting another. Fire bowing to fire. A promise sealed without words. The cycle was not yet visible, but it was already written into the bird's bones. And then the bird sang, not the low resonant cry of the first dawn, but something richer, a melody that rose and fell like breath, like light moving across water. The song was not sad. It held no mourning, for there was nothing yet to mourn. It was a song of pure presence, the sound of a creature that knows it will never truly end. The waters of Nun carried the notes outward, and the world, still empty, was no longer silent. The sun accepted a bow. It could do nothing else. The bird was its own soul, and the soul does not refuse the body. The warmth that poured down onto the Benben stone was not the general warmth of a star indifferent to what it touched. It was specific, directed, intimate. The bird felt it settle into the small circular marking on its breast, and the marking answered with a gentle pulse of light, like a heartbeat made visible. The bird remained on the stone for a long time. We would call it days, perhaps years, but time had not yet been measured, and the bird had no need to count. It stood in the sun and breathed. It folded its wings and unfolded them. It drank from the water that lapped against the base of the stone, and the water tasted of nothing but itself, and that was enough. The first life was a simple life, and it was perfect. The bird was not lonely. Loneliness requires the knowledge that others exist, and no others existed. The bird was complete in itself, a closed circle of light and feather and breath. It needed no companion, no mate, no offspring. The phoenix was the first living thing and the only living thing, and in that solitude there was no ache, only the quiet, sovereign peace of a being that lacks nothing. And yet, the bird was not idle. It watched the sun's path across the sky with an attention that was almost ritual. It noted how the light changed the color of the water. It felt the wind, the first wind, which had only just learned to move and adjusted its wings to meet it. The bird was studying the world, not with a mind that categorizes, but with a body that inhabits. It was learning to be the phoenix, and the lesson was long. The Egyptians would later say that the Bennu was the first priest, not because it performed rites or burned offerings, but because it was the first being to stand before the sun and understand that standing before the sun was a sacred act. The bird did not intercede for anyone. There was no one to intercede for. It simply witnessed, and its witness was enough to sanctify the dawn. Every morning since has been an echo of that first silent liturgy. One morning, and who can say which morning, in that age before numbers, the bird lifted its long, elegant legs, one after the other, and stepped off the Bennu stone. Its golden bronze-scaled feet touched the water, and the water held it. The bird did not sink. It walked across the surface of none, as though the sea were a floor of dark glass, and where it stepped, small ripples spread outward. The first journey ever made. The bird walked for a long time, and the horizon receded before it. It was not seeking anything. It was simply moving, because movement was a new gift, and the gift deserved to be used. The sun traveled with it, or seemed to, the bird's own soul following overhead, keeping pace. The phoenix was learning the shape of the world, and the world, in turn, was being shaped by the passage of the bird across its face. Eventually, the bird stopped. The Bennu stone was far behind now, a dark speck on the golden water. The bird looked back once, acknowledging the place of its emergence, and then it turned toward the east, toward the land that would one day be called Arabia, where spice trees would grow and a nest would one day be built. The bird did not know this. It only knew that something in that direction felt warm. And so the phoenix took flight. The great wings, rich gold with violet iridescence along the edges, opened fully and pressed down against the air. The bird rose from the water in a single, effortless motion, the deep crimson of its chest catching the sun, the three extravagant tail plumes trailing behind like ribbons of molten amber and coral pink tipped with pale ivory. The first flight was not a departure. It was a beginning. The moment the phoenix left the place of its making and entered the world, it would spend eternity renewing. The bird flew east, and the sun flew with it. Below, the dark waters of none gradually gave way to something paler, the first hint of sand, the first suggestion of a shore. The phoenix did not look down. It kept its brilliant liquid gold eyes fixed on the horizon, where the warmth was strongest, where the land was waiting. The spice groves were not yet grown. The nest was not yet woven, but the bird was on its way, and the world, at last, had a story to tell. Chapter 3. The still point of the turning world. The grove knew the bird was coming before it arrived. The cinnamon trees, their bark peeling in long russet scrolls, seemed to lean eastward as if the warmth that preceded the phoenix had already touched them. The frankincense bushes trembled without wind, and the myrrh shrubs wept golden tears that had not been there the day before. The air thickened with a sweetness that had no source. Something sacred was approaching, and the grove, in its wordless way, was preparing to receive it. The phoenix descended through the canopy in a slow spiral, its vast wings catching the light in flashes of rich gold and violet iridescence. The deep crimson of its chest was a wound of color against the pale sky, and its three ribbon-like tail plumes of molten amber and soft coral pink trailed behind like the afterimage of a flame. It landed on a low, broad branch of the oldest cinnamon tree, and the branch did not bend. The bird weighed nothing that the grove could not hold. The grove was everything the bird had been flying toward. Dense cinnamon trees with glossy, dark green leaves formed a high canopy that filtered the sun into shifting coins of gold. Cassia bushes with silver green leaves and clusters of small yellow flowers crowded the undergrowth. Myrrh shrubs, with knotted gray branches, oozed beads of golden sap that hardened in the warm air. The ground was sandy ochre, littered with fallen spice bark and dried petals, and the whole of it breathed a living temple of fragrance. The bird folded its wings and settled into stillness. Its long, slender neck turned slowly. The brilliant liquid gold eyes, with fine violet rings, taking in the grove with the calm attention of a creature that had all the time in the world. The slender crest of 3 delicate feathers, pale gold at the base, deepening to crimson at the tip, brushed against a cluster of cinnamon bark. The polished obsidian black beak parted slightly, tasting the air. The phoenix had found its home. And so the long years began. We cannot call them days, for the bird did not count them. The sun rose and set. The spice trees flowered and shed their petals. The myrrh hardened and was harvested by distant winds. And the phoenix remained. It was not waiting. It was living a life so slow and so perfect that the grove itself seemed to organize its rhythms around the bird's presence. The phoenix was the heart of the grove, and the grove was the body the bird had chosen. Each morning, the phoenix greeted the dawn. It would leave its low branch and walk to the eastern edge of the grove, its long, thin legs with golden bronze scaled feet, leaving delicate prints in the sandy ochre soil. There, where the trees parted and the desert began, it would lift its polished obsidian black beak toward the rising sun and drink the first light as if it were water. The deep crimson chest would glow, the single circular marking of palest gold pulsing once, and the day would begin. The bird's diet was the air itself, the incense of the grove, the breath of the frankincense and the myrrh. It did not hunt, for there was nothing to hunt. It did not forage, for it needed nothing the ground could provide. The fragrance that rose from the spice trees was enough. The phoenix consumed the prayers of the earth and was sustained by them, and the grove, in turn, seemed to grow richer for the bird's presence, as if the phoenix exhaled something the trees needed. There is no need to picture every hour of those centuries. It is enough to know that the bird was at peace. It preened its long flight feathers, deep violet fading to pale ash gray at the tips, with the patience of a scribe illuminating a manuscript. It walked among the cassia bushes, the 3 extravagant tail plumes brushing the silver-green leaves. It sang, sometimes the same melody that had first broken the silence of creation, now softened by the acoustics of the grove into something intimate, almost private. The world outside the grove was not empty, though the bird rarely saw it. Distant travelers, Arabian traders crossing the desert with caravans of spice and cloth, sometimes glimpsed a flash of crimson and gold through the trees. They left offerings at the edge of the grove, small clay bowls of water, bundles of dried frankincense, a single woven cloth laid flat on the sand. They did not enter. They knew, without being told, that the grove was not theirs to trespass. The bird was not a god to them, but it was not merely an animal either. It was something in between, a sacred presence, a living sign. The offerings accumulated over the years. The bird examined each one with the same calm curiosity, the brilliant liquid gold eyes studying a clay bowl, the polished obsidian black beak gently nudging a bundle of dried herbs, and then it would move on. It did not need these gifts, but it accepted them in the way the sun accepts the morning. The grove held the offerings at its edges, and they became part of the landscape, small markers of human awe, slowly swallowed by sand and spice and time. The bird drank from a small, still pool at the heart of the grove, a natural basin of pale limestone, fed by a spring that had no name. The water was clear and cool, and when the phoenix bent its long, slender neck to drink, its reflection rose to meet it deep crimson, rich gold, and the fine violet ring around each brilliant eye. The bird did not mistake the reflection for another. It knew itself, and the knowing was a kind of peace. The sun was the bird's only clock. It felt the subtle shift of seasons, not as we feel them, with calendars and harvests, but as a deepening or softening of the warmth on its feathers. The grove changed around the bird. Cinnamon bark peeled and regrew. Cassia flowers bloomed and fell. Myrrh sap hardened into gem-like tears. The phoenix remained the same. It was the still point in a turning world. the one thing the centuries could not touch. There were afternoons when the bird did nothing at all. It would rest on its broad branch, the long flight feathers deep violet fading to pale ash gray, hanging loose. The three-tailed plumes draped over the bark like ribbons of molten amber. Its brilliant, liquid gold eyes would half close, and a single, circular marking on its breast would glow with a slow, steady pulse, a heartbeat of light. The grove grew quiet around it, as if holding its breath. There is no need to imagine those hours. They were simply stillness, and they were enough. Occasionally, the bird shed a feather. It would drift down from the canopy, a single plume of deep crimson or rich gold or pale ash gray, and land on the sandy floor of the grove. The travelers who found these feathers treated them as relics. They pressed them between layers of linen, carried them across the desert to distant villages, and told stories of the firebird that lived in the spice grove and never died. The feather, held to the light, still shimmered faintly with an inner warmth. The stories grew over generations. A Bedouin mother told her children that the bird was the sun's own shadow, cast down to earth to remind the world that light always returns. A spice merchant claimed he had seen the phoenix bathe in the first rain of spring and emerge wreathed in steam. A poet in a distant city wrote verses about a bird whose song could heal the sick. None of these stories were entirely true, and none of them were entirely false. The phoenix, simply by existing, had become a mirror for human hope. And yet, the bird remained indifferent to its own legend. It did not know it was being written. It did not know that its feathers were relics, that its name, a name it had never given itself, was whispered in markets and temples across the known world. It only knew the grove, the rough bark of the cinnamon tree, the sharp sweetness of crushed cassia leaves, the way the morning light caught the golden sap of the myrrh. The bird's life was small, in the best sense. It was enough. One evening, as the sun sank low and the grove filled with violet shadow, the bird felt something new. A warmth, not the external warmth of the sun on its feathers, but an internal heat, a faint stirring deep within its breast, beneath the circular marking of palest gold. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was more like a memory, the distant echo of the fire that had shaped it, the reminder that the bird was not merely a creature of peace, but a creature of transformation. The warmth faded after a moment, but it left behind a quiet knowing. The phoenix did not resist the knowing. It had always understood, in the deep, wordless way that the sun understands it must set, that its life was not infinite in a single form. The cycle was written into its bones. The 500-year term was approaching, not tomorrow, not next year, but soon enough. And when it arrived, the bird would not fight it. It would gather spices, build a nest, and give itself to the fire. Not as a tragedy, as a promise. The grove seemed to sense the shift. The myrrh shrubs wept more freely, their golden sap running in thick rivulets down the gray bark. The cinnamon trees released their fragrance with a new intensity, as if they were already preparing to offer their bark for the nest. The bird walked among them slowly, its long, thin legs moving with deliberate grace, and it began to note the branches it would one day harvest. Not yet, but soon. The preparation had begun, quietly, without urgency, and so the years continued to pass. But now they passed with a difference. The bird still drank the dawn, still sang its wordless song, still rested on its broad branch through the long afternoons. But beneath the stillness, something was gathering, a warmth that did not fade, a pull toward the east, toward the sun's altar at Heliopolis, toward the fire that would unmake and remake it. The nest was not yet built. The myrrh was not yet gathered. But the phoenix knew, with the quiet certainty of a creature that had never known doubt, that the time was coming, and it was not afraid. Chapter 4. The Nest That Was a Cradle. The grove began to give more than it had ever given before. Cinnamon bark, which had peeled in thin, reluctant scrolls for centuries, now loosened at the slightest touch of the bird's polished obsidian black beak. The myrrh shrubs, their knotted gray branches, ancient and slow, wept golden sap in thick rivulets that hardened almost as quickly as they formed. The cassia bushes dropped their silver-green leaves in drifts, as if offering themselves. The grove knew what was coming, and it was preparing to let the bird go. The warmth in the phoenix's breast had become a constant companion. It was no longer a distant echo or a fleeting memory. It was a steady, gentle heat that pulsed beneath the single, circular marking of palest gold, like a second heartbeat. The bird did not resist it. It did not fear it. It simply acknowledged the warmth the way it acknowledged the sun, with a quiet, ancient acceptance. The time had come. The 500-year term was closing, and the bird had work to do. The phoenix began its gathering on a morning when the light was pale and soft, the kind of morning that feels like a held breath. It walked through the grove with a new deliberation, its long, thin legs, with golden bronze scaled feet, moving not in the aimless, meditative stroll of the centuries before, but with purpose. The brilliant liquid gold eyes with fine violet rings examined each cinnamon tree, each cassia bush, each myrrh shrub, assessing, selecting. The bird was not merely inhabiting the grove now. It was harvesting it. The first material the bird chose was cinnamon. It approached the oldest tree, the same broad-limbed giant on which it had first landed 5 centuries before, and worked its polished obsidian black beak beneath a long, curling scroll of russet bark. The bark came away easily, as if the tree had been holding it loosely for just this moment. The bird carried the scroll to a small clearing at the heart of the grove, the same clearing where the limestone spring pooled, and laid it on the sandy ochre ground. The nest had begun. The bird returned to the trees again and again. It selected only the finest branches, cassia stems, with their silver-green leaves still attached, their clusters of small yellow flowers adding a pale brightness to the growing pile. It gathered frankincense bark in long, aromatic strips, the pale green surface beaded with white resin tears that caught the light. It worked steadily, unhurriedly, as if the act of gathering were itself a form of prayer. The pile in the clearing grew slowly, and the grove grew quieter around it. The myrrh was the last material, and the most precious. The bird approached the oldest myrrh shrub, a gnarled, ancient thing with bark like cracked leather, and waited. It did not pry the sap away. It simply stood, its deep crimson chest rising and falling with slow breaths, and let the shrub weep. The golden sap oozed from the gray bark in thick, luminous beads, and the bird caught each one on the tip of its polished obsidian black beak, carrying it carefully back to the clearing. The myrrh would line the nest, a soft and fragrant bed for the fire to come. There is no need to picture every journey the bird made, every branch selected and laid in place. It is enough to know that the gathering took many days, perhaps many weeks, and that the phoenix never hurried. It paused often, standing at the edge of the clearing with its long, slender neck curved toward the sun, the slender crest of 3 delicate feathers, pale gold at the base, deepening to crimson at the tip, stirring in the warm breeze. It drank from the limestone spring. It sang sometimes, the same melody that had broken the silence of creation, now softer, more intimate, a lullaby for the self it was about to release. The nest, when it began to take shape, was a thing of quiet beauty. The bundled cinnamon sticks formed a shallow, wide bowl, cupped like an open palm. The cassia branches wove through the cinnamon in a delicate lattice, their yellow flowers adding small points of light. The frankincense bark lined the interior, its white resin tears gleaming like tiny stars, and the myrrh gum softened the whole structure with a golden, honeyed warmth. The nest did not look like a deathbed. It looked like an offering. The bird stood beside the half-built nest one evening, the amber light of the setting sun filtering through the canopy and catching the violet iridescence along the edges of its folded wings. The deep crimson of its chest was muted in the shadow, but the single circular marking of palest gold glowed with a steady, patient light. The brilliant liquid gold eye studied the nest, the curve of the bowl, the placement of each stick with the calm assessment of a creature that had done this many times before and would do it many times again. And yet, the bird did not rush to finish. It spent whole days in stillness, resting on its broad branch. The 3 extravagant tail plumes of molten amber and soft coral pink, each tipped with a pale ivory eye spot, draped over the bark. It drank the dawn as it always had. It walked among the trees, brushing its slender crest against the cinnamon bark, breathing in the fragrance of the grove. It was saying goodbye not with grief, but with gratitude. The grove had held it for 5 centuries, and the bird was thanking the grove the only way it knew, by being fully present in the time that remained. The day came when the last stick of cinnamon was laid in place. The bird had worked through the morning, weaving the final cassia branches into the lattice, tucking the last beads of myrrh gum into the bowl's soft interior. The nest was complete. A shallow, perfect cup of spice and resin and pale gold flowers, resting on the sandy ochre floor of the clearing, as if it had always been there. The phoenix stepped back, its long, thin legs carrying it a few paces away, and regarded its work. The nest seemed to breathe. The fragrance that rose from it, cinnamon and cassia, frankincense and myrrh, was so rich and so layered that the air itself felt thick, almost visible, a golden haze that hung over the clearing like a benediction. The white resin tears of the frankincense caught the sunlight and held it, and the myrrh gum glowed with a deep amber warmth. The nest was not a pyre. It was a cradle, and the bird was about to lay itself down in it. The phoenix did not enter the nest immediately. It walked to the limestone spring one last time and drank, the brilliant liquid gold eyes watching its own reflection with a calm, unhurried tenderness. It preened its long flight feathers, deep violet fading to pale ash gray at the tips, drawing the polished obsidian black beak through each one with the same patient care it had given the nest. It was preparing itself not for death, but for change. The distinction was important, and the bird understood it perfectly. That evening, the bird sang. It stood at the edge of the clearing, the completed nest behind it, and lifted its voice toward the darkening sky. The song was different now. Not the bright, wordless melody of creation, not the soft lullaby of the gathering days, but something deeper, richer, a song that held both farewell and anticipation in equal measure. The grove listened. The myrrh shrubs stilled their weeping. The cinnamon trees ceased their rustling. Even the spring seemed to pause, its surface flattening to a perfect mirror. There is no need to picture the song too precisely. It is enough to know that it was beautiful. Not the beauty of performance, but the beauty of truth. The bird was not mourning. It was not celebrating. It was simply acknowledging what was about to happen with the full presence of its being. The song said, "I have loved this life. I have loved this grove. And now I will love the fire too." The night passed slowly. The phoenix did not sleep. It stood beside the nest, its tall, elegant, crane-like body motionless, the deep crimson of its chest dark in the starlight, the single circular marking of palest gold, the only light in the clearing. The brilliant liquid gold eyes remained open, watching the sky, watching the stars wheel through their silent courses. The warmth in its breast had grown stronger now. Not yet a fire, but the promise of one. The bird was waiting for the dawn. The dawn came, as it always does, whether the world is ready or not. The first pale gold light touched the canopy of the spiced grove and filtered down in long, slow shafts. The phoenix turned toward the east and lifted its polished obsidian black beak to drink the light one final time. The deep crimson chest glowed. The single marking pulsed once, brighter than it had ever pulsed before. And then the bird turned away from the sun and faced the nest. The bird stepped into the nest slowly, deliberately, its golden bronze scaled feet finding the soft bed of myrrh gum and frankincense. It lowered its body into the shallow bowl, folding its long, thin legs beneath itself, tucking its wings against its sides. The nest cupped the bird perfectly, as if it had been shaped for this exact form, and of course, it had. The slender crest of 3 delicate feathers, pale gold at the base, deepening to crimson at the tip, rested against the woven cassia. The 3 tail plumes draped over the edge of the nest. The bird settled, and the grove fell utterly silent. The inner warmth that had been growing for so long now began to intensify. It was not pain. The phoenix did not experience pain in the way mortals understand it. It was a gathering, a focusing, a concentration of all the sunlight the bird had ever absorbed, all the fragrance it had ever inhaled, all the life it had lived over 500 years. The single circular marking of palest gold at the center of the bird's breast began to glow brighter, then brighter still, until it was no longer a marking, but a small, contained sun. The bird closed its brilliant, liquid gold eyes. The slender crest feathers stirred in a heap that had not yet become visible. Around the nest, the air shimmered. A faint spiral of aromatic smoke began to rise from the bundled cinnamon sticks. Not fire yet, but the breath before fire. The moment when everything holds still and the world waits. The phoenix did not struggle. It did not cry out. It simply let go, trusting the fire, trusting the dawn, trusting the ancient promise that what burned would rise again. And the fire, at last, began. Chapter 5. The Fire That Was a Doorway. The flame did not roar. It whispered. It began at the heart of the nest, a single tongue of gold licking upward from the bundled cinnamon sticks, so small and so quiet that a passing breeze might have mistaken it for a sunbeam. But the breeze did not come. The grove held its breath. The flame caught the cassia leaves, and the cassia leaves caught the frankincense, and the nest became a bowl of gentle fire. The phoenix did not move. It rested in the center of the flame, as if the fire were a warm bath drawn after a long journey. The deep crimson of its chest deepened further, the rich gold of its wings shimmering through the heat haze, the long flight feathers deep violet fading to pale ash gray at the tips, beginning to glow at their edges. The brilliant liquid gold eyes remained closed. The slender crest of 3 delicate feathers stirred in the rising warmth. There was no struggle, no cry, no resistance. The fire was not an enemy. It had never been an enemy. The bird understood this in the deep, wordless way it understood the sun, not as a force that destroys, but as a force that transforms. The flames were only sunlight that had been stored in spice and feather and breath, now releasing all at once. The bird was not being consumed. It was being translated from one form to another, from one age to the next. The nest burned with a fragrance that filled the grove and spilled out into the desert beyond. Cinnamon and cassia, myrrh and frankincense, the scents that had sustained the bird for 5 centuries were now rising as a final offering to the sky. The smoke was not black and acrid, but pale gold, a column of aromatic light spiraling upward through the canopy. A traveler standing at the edge of the desert would have seen it and known, without knowing how, that something sacred was happening. The fire reached its peak, and the clearing was illuminated with a soft, golden radiance. The flames did not leap or crackle. They flowed, liquid and slow, wrapping the bird's form in a cocoon of light. The deep crimson chest was no longer visible as feathers, but as a heart of pure warmth. The rich gold wings spread one final time, not in pain, but in release, and the 3 ribbon-like tail plumes of molten amber and soft coral pink dissolved into the fire like silk into water. And then, slowly, the fire began to subside. It had no more to consume. The spices had given all their fragrance. The bird had given all its form. The flames lowered themselves into the nest, shrinking from gold to amber to a deep, pulsing ruby. The clearing grew quieter still. If such a thing were possible, the column of pale smoke thinned, became a wisp, became nothing. The fire, having done its work, prepared to rest. The embers glowed for a long time. They were the color of late sunlight on sandstone, and they breathed with a slow, steady rhythm, as if the nest itself had a heartbeat. The cinnamon sticks were now blackened scrolls, the cassia branches delicate lattices of charcoal, the myrrh gum a hardened amber gloss on the ashes. The shape of the bird was no longer visible, but the warmth of it remained, a presence felt more than seen, a promise waiting in the embers. The embers cooled. The soft gray ash settled over the remains of the nest, like a snowfall in miniature, pale and fine and utterly still. The clearing was silent. The limestone spring had stopped its gentle welling. The cinnamon trees had ceased their rustling. Even the sun seemed to pause at the edge of the canopy, its light filtering down in long, hesitant shafts, as if unsure whether it was yet welcome. There is no need to picture the ash too clearly. It is enough to know that it was there, and that it was peaceful, and that the grove had never known a stillness so complete. The morning light fell on the pale gray mound, and nothing moved. The world, for a long moment, held nothing at all. No bird, no fire, no sound. Only the quiet fact of completion, resting on the sandy floor of the clearing, like a whispered amen. And then, from the center of the ash, a light stirred. It was faint at first, the smallest possible glow, a single point of palest gold no larger than a seed. It pulsed once, twice, and then it held steady, a tiny sun in the gray waste. The ash around it began to tremble, not from wind, but from the quiet insistence of life gathering itself. The promise that had been planted 5 centuries ago was beginning to bloom. The light grew. It pushed upward through the ash with a patience that was ancient and unhurried. The same patience that had waited 5 centuries for this moment. The pale gray powder parted, and a shape began to emerge. A head, slender and elegant, with a polished obsidian black beak that caught the morning light. Then a neck, long and graceful, curving upward from the ashes like a question being asked of the sun. The slender crest of 3 delicate feathers, pale gold at the base, deepening to crimson at the tip, unfurled last, still soft from the fire. The new phoenix opened its eyes. They were the same brilliant liquid gold with fine violet rings that had closed upon the fire, and yet they held something new, not a different soul, but a refreshed one, a soul that had been washed in flame and returned cleaner. The eyes blinked once, slowly, and then they focused on the world, the cinnamon trees, the cassia bushes, the limestone spring, the golden light filtering through the canopy. The bird was seeing the grove for the first time. Again, the body followed the head. The deep crimson chest rose from the ash, feather by feather, each one vivid and fresh, as if painted moments ago by the same sun that had painted the first phoenix at the dawn of creation. The rich gold wings, with violet iridescence along the edges, unfolded, testing the air. The long flight feathers, deep violet fading to pale ash gray at the tips, stretched outward, and the bird felt the familiar weight of them, familiar and yet new, like a song remembered from a dream. The 3 extravagant tail plumes emerged last, uncoiling from the ash like ribbons of molten amber and soft coral pink, each tipped with a pale ivory eye spot. They draped over the charred remains of the nest, the blackened cinnamon sticks, the delicate lattices of charcoal, the hardened amber gloss of the myrrh, and the contrast between the old and the new was not sad. It was complete. The fire had taken nothing that was not meant to be given. The bird was whole. The phoenix stepped out of the nest. Its long, thin legs, the same golden bronze scaled feet that had carried it through 5 centuries and 1 death, found the sandy ochre ground and held steady. The bird stood beside the mound of ash and charcoal, tall and elegant and utterly still, and it looked at the remains of its former self with the calm, ancient gaze of a creature that understood the transaction exactly. The old form had been the price of the new one, and the price had been paid willingly. There is no need to picture the bird's first breath in too much detail. It is enough to know that it breathed a deep, full inhalation of the spice-laden air, the fragrance of cinnamon and myrrh still hanging heavy over the clearing, and that the breath felt like a gift. The single circular marking of palest gold at the center of the deep crimson chest glowed with a steady, quiet light. The same light that had been there before the fire. The same light that would be there after the next. It was the bird's true name, written in flame. The grove exhaled. The cinnamon trees rustled. Though there was no wind, the myrrh shrubs began to weep again. Not in mourning, but in relief. The limestone spring, which had stilled during the fire, resumed its gentle welling. The water spilling over the pale stone basin and into the sandy soil. The grove had held its breath for the entire transformation, and now it breathed again, and its breath was fragrant with welcome. The new phoenix lifted its polished obsidian black beak toward the sun, the same sun that had witnessed its birth at the beginning of the world, the same sun that would witness its birth at the end of it, and it sang. The song was not the soft lullaby of the gathering days, or the deep farewell of the night before the fire. It was a song of pure presence, bright and clear, the sound of a creature that had kept its promise and been kept by it. The waters of the spring carried the notes outward, and the grove listened. When the song ended, the bird lowered its head and looked at the ashes of its former self. The mound of pale gray powder, the blackened cinnamon scrolls, the fragile charcoal lattices, these were not waste. They were relics. The bird knew, with the same deep certainty that had guided it to the grove 5 centuries ago, that these remains must be gathered, embalmed, and carried to the sun's altar at Heliopolis. The journey was not over. It was only entering its next phase. And so the phoenix, newly risen and still warm from the fire, began its work. It bent its long, slender neck, and, with the same delicate precision that had built the nest, began to gather the ashes of its former self into a small, neat pile. The brilliant liquid gold eyes were calm, unhurried. The slender crest of 3 delicate feathers stirred in the soft morning breeze. The bird was not grieving. It was performing a duty, the same duty it had performed 1,000 times before, and would perform 1,000 times again. The sun climbed higher, and the grove, now fully awake, watched over the phoenix as it prepared to carry its own history home. Chapter 6. The altar receives its proof. The ashes were not a burden. They were a promise wrapped in linen, and the bird gathered them with the same deliberate care it had given to every act of its long existence. The polished obsidian black beak worked gently, drawing the pale gray powder and the charred fragments of cinnamon and cassia into a neat mound. The brilliant liquid gold eyes with fine violet rings studied the work with calm precision. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was mourned. The remains of the former self were not a corpse. They were a testament. When the ashes were gathered, the bird turned to the myrrh shrubs that ringed the clearing. The shrubs, which had wept so freely in the days before the fire, now offered their final gift. Thick, golden tears of resin that had hardened into gem-like beads on the gray bark. The bird collected each bead with the tip of its polished obsidian black beak carrying them to the mound of ash. The myrrh would bind the remains, preserving them for the journey ahead. The bird worked the myrrh with its beak and the delicate pressure of its deep crimson chest, warming the resin until it softened and spread. It mixed the golden gum with the pale ash, forming a thick, aromatic paste that released the scent of century cinnamon and cassia, frankincense and myrrh. And beneath them all, the faint, clean smell of fire. The paste was shaped into an ovoid bundle, roughly the size of a small loaf, and the bird worked with the patience of an embalmer who had been practicing since before the world had words for such things. The bundle was wrapped in strips of pale cream linen that the bird had not brought with it, but which had been left at the grove's edge generations ago, an offering from travelers who had never seen the phoenix, but had trusted that it would one day need this gift. The linen was still soft, preserved by the dry desert air, and it took the myrrh-stained bundle into itself like a hand accepting another hand. The bird wound the strips carefully, tucking the final end beneath a fold, and then it drew back to examine its work. The embalmed bundle rested on the sandy floor of the clearing, pale cream linen wrapped around the ovoid form, tinged gold where the myrrh had seeped through. The bird steadied it with its brilliant liquid gold eyes. And then it did something it had not done in 5 centuries. It plucked a single feather from its own breast, a deep crimson plume, vivid and warm, and tucked it into the wrappings. The feather was a signature, a seal, a promise that the one who had burned was the same one who now stood above the ashes. The bundle was complete. There is no need to picture the moment of departure too precisely. It is enough to know that the bird lifted the bundle gently in its polished obsidian black beak, and that the bundle weighed almost nothing, and that the grove, which had held the phoenix for 500 years, was now ready to let it go. The cinnamon trees rustled their farewell. The myrrh shrubs glistened. The limestone spring reflected the bird's deep crimson chest and rich gold wings one final time. And then the phoenix spread its vast wings and rose. The flight was long, but the bird did not tire. It had been made for this. The great wings with violet iridescence along the edges, pressing down against the warm desert air. The long flight feathers deep violet fading to pale ash gray at the tips, cutting a steady path westward. Below, the spice grove receded into a dark smudge of green, and then the desert opened beneath the bird like a vast, pale scroll. The sun traveled with the phoenix, its own soul keeping pace overhead, and the bundle in the bird's beak was as light as a whispered word. The landscape changed beneath the bird's shadow. The pale sand of Arabia gave way to the narrow blue ribbon of the Red Sea, its surface catching the sun in scattered coins of light. The bird crossed the water without hesitation, its brilliant liquid gold eyes fixed on the western horizon. Beyond the sea, the land greened again. The Nile Valley, a long emerald serpent winding through the desert, its banks crowded with papyrus reeds and date palms, and the small brown squares of mud brick villages. The bird followed the river north. It passed over fields of wheat and flax, over temples and marketplaces, over fishermen in small wooden boats who looked up and saw a flash of crimson and gold and thought they had witnessed a piece of the sun fall to earth. The phoenix did not pause. It had flown this route before 1,000 times before, across 1,000 lifetimes, and it knew the way the sun knows the sky. Heliopolis was ahead, and the altar was waiting. The city of the sun appeared on the horizon as the dawn broke. The massive limestone pylons of the temple caught the first light, their carved sun disk reliefs glowing like molten bronze. The bird descended slowly, its vast wings spread wide, the deep crimson of its chest a living flame against the pale morning sky. Below, in the temple courtyard, the reflecting pool caught the bird's reflection before anyone else saw it, a double of gold and violet skimming across the dark green water. The phoenix had arrived. The temple courtyard was empty when the phoenix landed. It touched down on the warm, honey-gold limestone flagstones with the silence of a feather settling on still water. Its long, thin legs, with golden bronze scaled feet, finding the worn stone as if they had never left. The bundle of pale cream linen was still cradled gently in its polished obsidian black beak. The bird folded its vast wings, the rich gold with violet iridescence catching the dawn, and it stood in the center of the courtyard, like a living flame returned to its hearth. The priest of Heliopolis was the first to see it. He had risen before the sun, as he did every morning, to light the incense at the solar altar, his shaven head still cool from the night air, his simple white linen shendite belted at the waist, the leopard skin mantle draped over one shoulder. When he entered the courtyard and saw the bird standing beside the reflecting pool, tall, elegant, deep crimson and rich gold, the censer in his hand trembled once. Then he set it down carefully, pressed his palms together, and bowed. The elder priestess of the Bennu came next, her long silver-gray hair loose and unadorned, falling past her shoulders in soft waves. She had served the bird since she was a girl, and her slight, stooped body moved with the unwavering certainty of someone who had been waiting for this morning for half a century. The single phoenix tail feather tucked into her hair, ash-gray at the tip, stirred as she walked. She did not bow. She simply looked into the bird's brilliant, liquid gold eyes and smiled, the way one greets an old friend who has kept their promise. Other priests and priestesses gathered at the edges of the courtyard, their white linen robes pale against the honey-gold stone. The scribe of the temple, a slight young man with a shaven head and a scribal palette of polished wood hanging from his shoulder, pressed his back against a papyrus bundle column and stared with wide, disbelieving eyes. He had read the old texts. He had copied the hymns to the Bennu 100 times, but the words had not prepared him for the bird itself, the sheer, quiet weight of its presence. The phoenix walked toward the solar altar. Its gold and bronze scaled feet made no sound on the worn flagstones. The altar rose before it, a rectangular raised platform of warm honey-gold limestone, darkened by centuries of incense smoke, with carved sun-disk motifs and urea serpents along its rim. Faint scorch marks from ancient offerings marked the stone. The bird approached the eastern steps, and the elder priestess moved aside to give it room. She did not touch the bird. No one touched the bird. The phoenix lowered its long, slender neck and placed the embalmed bundle on the altar. The pale cream linen, tinged gold where the myrrh had seeped through, rested gently in the shallow offering basin, carved into the top surface. The single, deep crimson feather tucked into the wrappings caught the morning light and glowed. The bird drew back, its brilliant, liquid gold eyes studying the bundle for a long moment, and then it lifted its polished obsidian black beak toward the rising sun and stood in perfect stillness. The elder priestess stepped forward and raised her hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was old and cracked, but it carried across the courtyard with the clarity of a bell. She recited the ancient words, the hymn of the Bennu, the song of the soul of Ra, the prayer that had been spoken on this altar since before the temple walls were raised. The other priests joined her, their voices a low murmur beneath hers, and the scribe, his hands shaking slightly, began to write it all down. There is no need to picture every word of the ritual. It is enough to know that it was performed, and that it was beautiful, and that the phoenix stood before the altar as the sun climbed higher, and the incense rose in pale spirals, and the voices of the priests wove a net of sound around the sacred moment. The embalmed bundle, small and pale on the dark, scorched stone, was the proof the temple had been waiting for. The cycle was real. The promise was kept, and the bird had returned. When the ritual ended, the phoenix lowered its head one final time toward the altar. The same bow it had given the sun at the dawn of creation. The same bow it would give 1,000 times again. and then it turned away. It walked across the courtyard, past the reflecting pool where its reflection skimmed the dark green water, past the benben stone on its raised dais, past the date palms and the acacia trees, and it spread its great wings and rose into the sky. The priests watched until the bird was a speck of gold against the blue, and then they watched a little longer. The embalmed bundle remained on the altar. It would stay there for many days, visited by priests and pilgrims who came to touch the stone beside it and whisper their own prayers for renewal. The deep crimson feather tucked into the linen would be removed and placed in a small shrine to the Bennu, where it would rest beside other feathers from other ages, a quiet archive of eternity. And somewhere far to the east, the phoenix was already flying toward the spice grove, toward the long centuries of peace, toward the fire that would one day call it home again. Chapter 7. The Fire That Never Dies. The feather in the shrine was not the first. It was not the last. In a small chamber off the main courtyard at Heliopolis, a quiet archive of eternity rested in the shadows. Feathers from other ages, other cycles, other birds that were also this bird. Some were deep crimson, some pale gold, some ash gray at the tip. Each one had been tucked into linen wrappings and placed on the altar. And then, when the bundle was unwrapped and the ashes scattered, kept. The shrine was a library, written in plumage. The scribe of the temple grew old in the service of this archive. The slight young man who had pressed his back against a papyrus bundle column, trembling at his first sight of the phoenix, became a stooped elder with ink-stained fingers, and eyes that had seen the bird return twice more. His scribal palette of polished wood, worn smooth by decades of use, still hung from his shoulder. He copied the hymns, recorded the dates of each arrival, and added his own quiet observations in the margins, the color of the dawn, the exact angle of the bird's bow. The Egyptians had understood the Bennu long before the Greeks gave it a new name. For the priests of Heliopolis, the bird was not a myth. It was a theological truth. The Bennu was the soul of Ra, the Ba that had witnessed the first sunrise and would witness the last. It was the force that drove the Nile's inundation, the power that pushed the first green shoot through the black silt each year. The phoenix was not merely a creature that rose from its own ashes. It was the principle of renewal itself, given feathers. The pyramid texts, carved into the walls of royal tombs at Saqqara more than 4,000 years ago, spoke of the Bennu as the first being to stand on the benben stone. The Book of the Dead promised the deceased that they too could become the Bennu, could rise from the waters of death as the bird had risen from the waters of creation. To an Egyptian soul facing the long journey through the underworld, the phoenix was not a story to be told. It was a destiny to be claimed. The Greeks, when they encountered the story, gave it a new shape. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, recorded the phoenix with the careful skepticism of a historian who had heard something too beautiful to be true. He described the bird's red and gold plumage, its 500-year cycle, its journey from Arabia to Heliopolis with the embalmed parent. He admitted he had never seen it himself, only paintings and accounts from the priests, and yet he wrote it down, because some stories, he understood, matter whether or not they are literally true. Ovid, the Roman poet, took the story and made it sing. In the Metamorphoses, the phoenix becomes a meditation on time and transformation, the one creature in all the world that does not die but renews itself, again and again, while empires crumble and languages vanish. Pliny the Elder, ever the naturalist, tried to pin the bird down with facts. The nest of cinnamon and cassia, the worm that becomes the new bird, the specimen displayed in Rome in the year 47 of the Common Era. The phoenix, in Roman hands, became both a wonder and a puzzle. Then came the Christians. Clement of Rome, writing to the Corinthians at the end of the 1st century, pointed to the phoenix as proof that resurrection was not impossible, that God had placed in the natural world a sign of what he intended for the human soul. The medieval bestiaries followed, their illuminated pages showing the phoenix in nests of flame, golden and red against backgrounds of lapis and gold leaf. The bird that had been the soul of Ra became a symbol of Christ, and the fire that had been a doorway in the spice grove became a metaphor for the grave. There is no need to trace every turn of the phoenix through history. It is enough to know that the story survived, that it passed from Egyptian temple walls to Greek scrolls to Roman codices, to Christian manuscripts, to the quiet, electric hum of the modern world, and that at every step, it meant something slightly different and something fundamentally the same. The bird never changed. The bird never needed to. It was the perfect vessel for the human longing it carried. The real Heliopolis still exists, though its pylons have fallen and its reflecting pool is dry. The site lies on the northeast edge of modern Cairo, a sprawl of low ruins amid the traffic and dust of the city. The Bennu stone is gone, carried away by conquerors or swallowed by time. And the Temple of Ra is a field of broken limestone and scattered pottery. But the place remembers. The archaeologists who work there still find small amulets of birds, tiny feathers carved in faience and gold, offerings left by people who believed that the Bennu would return. And the Bennu did return not as a bird, perhaps, but as an idea. The phoenix lives in every story of a character who loses everything and begins again. It lives in the quiet resilience of a person who has been burned by life and still gets up in the morning. It lives in the annual flooding of rivers, the spring greening of trees, the stubborn green shoot pushing through the blackened soil after a fire. The myth is not a lie we tell ourselves. It is a truth we keep forgetting and remembering, across every generation. The ancient sources, for all their disagreements about the bird's lifespan and the color of its feathers, agreed on one thing. The phoenix was solitary. There was never a flock. There was never a mate. There was only ever one bird at a time, carrying the weight of eternity alone. This detail, more than any other, is what gives the myth its strange, aching tenderness. The phoenix does not renew itself for anyone else. It renews itself because renewal is what it is. The solitude is not loneliness. It is integrity. The firebird archetype did not end with the phoenix. It spread across cultures like light across water. The Chinese fen huang, the Persian samurg, the Slavic firebird, the Russian jarpitsa. Each culture found its own way to tell the story of a bird that burns and returns. The details differ, but the core remains. Fire is not the end. Fire is the hinge. And somewhere in every human heart, there is a small, quiet voice that recognizes this as true. Modern science, with its long gaze and its hunger for explanation, has proposed theories. Perhaps the phoenix was a flamingo, its pink plumage mistaken for fire. Perhaps the myth originated with the Egyptian practice of embalming birds and burying them in clay jars, from which new life insects, beetles, would sometimes emerge. Perhaps the spice grove was a real place, a frankincense plantation in southern Arabia, where a spectacular bird was glimpsed once every few generations. Perhaps. But explanations do not explain the thing that matters. The thing that matters is not whether a bird ever actually burned on a nest of cinnamon and rose from the ashes 3 days later. The thing that matters is that the story has refused to die. It has outlasted the temple that housed it, the priests who sang to it, the language that first named it. It has crossed oceans in centuries, in entire civilizations, and it has never lost its quiet, steady pulse. The phoenix survives because we need it to survive. There is no need to picture the bird anymore. It is enough to know that it exists somewhere, in the long groves of the mind, in the quiet places where hope is kept. The story of the phoenix is not an instruction. It does not tell you how to live. It simply stands beside you, a tall, elegant, crane-like bird with brilliant, liquid gold eyes, and waits. It knows that you, too, have burned. It knows that you, too, can rise, and it does not rush you. It has all the time in the world. The priest at Heliopolis, who watched the bird place the bundle on the altar, what did he feel? In the silence that followed, the scribe who recorded the feather's arrival, who touched the linen with his ink-stained fingers, what did he understand that we have forgotten? Perhaps only this, that the sacred does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, on a morning like any other, and it leaves a small bundle on an altar, and then it flies away, and the world is not the same. The temple of Heliopolis is quiet now. Its stones are scattered, its inscriptions worn by wind and war. But the story it held is not quiet. It breathes in every hospital room, where a patient opens their eyes after a long surgery. It breathes in every burnt field that greens again after a wildfire. It breathes in every person who has ever stood in the ashes of a former life and felt, against all evidence, the first faint warmth of a new beginning. The temple is gone. The bird is not. The Egyptians believed that the Bennu would return at the end of time, that it would land once more on the Ben stone, fold its great wings, and sing the world back into existence. It is a beautiful thought. Whether or not it is true, a bird that has witnessed every dawn, carrying the memory of every life, singing the final note that is also the first, the cycle closing, the promise kept. But the phoenix does not need the end of the world to return. It returns whenever someone who has given up finds the strength to begin again. It returns whenever a story that should have been forgotten is told one more time. It returns whenever you close your eyes in the darkness and trust, without proof, without guarantee that the light will come. That trust is the bird. It always has been. And so the phoenix flies. It does not look back. It has never needed to. The spice groves of Arabia still grow somewhere, their cinnamon bark peeling in long russet scrolls, their myrrh shrubs weeping golden tears. The sun still rises over the Nile, and the water still catches the light in scattered coins of gold. And somewhere, on a low branch of the oldest cinnamon tree, a tall, elegant, crane-like bird with deep crimson chest and rich gold wings, and brilliant, liquid gold eyes that hold centuries of silent wisdom waits through the long afternoon, patient and unhurried, ready for the fire that will one day call it home again. The story does not end. It only pauses, like a feather resting on still water, waiting for the next breath of wind.